By early 1944, the war had already stretched itself thin across Europe, grinding down cities, armies, and civilians alike. In Western Germany, as Allied bombing intensified and the front lines shifted closer each month, the distinction between soldier and civilian began to blur, especially for women. Factories, rail yards, communication centers, and supply depots depended heavily on female labor. When towns fell or units surrendered, thousands of women found themselves swept into captivity, not as combatants, but as part of a collapsing system that no longer had the luxury of clarity. The camp where this story unfolds was not famous. It would never appear in history books by name. It sat on the outskirts of a damaged industrial town near the Rhine, hastily converted in late 1944 to hold prisoners as American forces advanced eastward. Former warehouses and assembly halls became barracks. Concrete floors replaced beds. Windows were boarded or broken. Heat was unreliable, sanitation minimal. The camp was overcrowded almost immediately. Among those brought there were German women of different ages and backgrounds. Factory workers from Essen, clerks from Cologne, farm girls from the countryside, and even a few nurses who had been attached to military hospitals during earlier phases of the war. Most were in their late teens or early 20s. Some were older. A few had children they had been separated from only days before. They arrived exhausted. The first thing many of them noticed wasn't the guards, or the barbed wire, or the strange sound of American voices. It was the floor, bare concrete, cold even in daylight. At night, it seemed to pull heat directly from their bones. The second thing they noticed was the rule. They were not allowed to sit. At first, the women thought they had misunderstood. Orders were shouted in English, then repeated in broken German by a translator. Stand! Stay up! The guards motioned with their hands, palms down when someone tried to crouch, rifles tilted slightly forward, not threatening, but firm. They assumed it was temporary. Processing, perhaps. A count. An inspection. Hours passed. Their legs began to shake. Many of them had already marched long distances before reaching the camp. Some had been herded onto trucks, others onto trains, and many had simply walked. Hands, palms down when someone tried to crouch, rifles tilted slightly forward, not threatening, but firm. They assumed it was temporary. Processing, perhaps. A count. An inspection. The first woman to collapse was a textile worker from Dusseldorf, no more than 19. She swayed, reached for the wall, and slid down before anyone could stop her. A murmur passed through the line of prisoners. The guards moved quickly, not with anger, but urgency. One knelt, checked her face, waved for a medic. She was carried out. But the rule remained. No sitting, the interpreter repeated. Stand. No explanation was given. As the day wore on, pain replaced confusion. Calves burned. Knees locked. Lower backs screamed. Some women shifted their weight from foot to foot, trying to keep circulation moving. Others leaned against one another, sharing balance the way tired passengers do on overcrowded trains. Whispers spread. They're doing this on purpose. It's punishment. They want to break us. The truth was more complicated and far less cruel than many feared, but at that moment, none of them could know that. By late afternoon, several women were crying quietly. Not loudly. Crying took energy they didn't have. Tears simply ran down pale, dirt-streaked faces.
Calves burned. Knees locked. Lower backs screamed. Some women shifted their weight from foot to foot, trying to keep circulation moving.
They won't let us sit at all. Night came early that winter. The lights inside the barracks were harsh, bright bulbs that never fully dimmed. Shadows stretched across the concrete floor. The women were still standing. At some point, American medics arrived. Real medics, not guards pretending to know what they were doing. They moved along the line, observing quietly. They didn't speak much German, but they didn't need to. Swollen ankles, blue toes, lips trembling from cold. The signs were obvious. One medic spoke sharply to an officer. The officer frowned. A discussion followed, brief, tense, but controlled. No shouting, no threats. Orders were given. Still, the women remained standing. What they didn't know was that the camp had already dealt with multiple cases of trench foot and frostbite in the previous weeks. Prisoners, both male and female, had collapsed after sitting or lying on cold surfaces for too long, cutting off circulation in already weakened limbs. Several had lost toes. One man had lost part of his foot.
The women were still standing. At some point, American medics arrived. Real medics, not...
As hours turned into a full night, exhaustion reached a new level. Muscles stopped burning and went numb instead. Pain dulled into something heavier and more dangerous, a feeling that limbs no longer belonged to the body. One woman, a former office clerk from Mainz, whispered to the woman beside her, "If I sit, I don't think I'll stand again." The woman beside her nodded. She felt the same. Some guards noticed this. They weren't blind. They weren't indifferent. They simply had orders and limited resources. The camp was understaffed, supplies were short, the front was still moving.
Cases of trench foot and frostbite in the previous weeks. Prisoners, both male and female, had collapsed after sitting or lying on cold surfaces for too long.
Keeping blood moving. Guards watched closely, correcting posture, forcing anyone who slowed too much to keep going. Some women nearly collapsed anyway, but fewer did. Food arrived later that morning. Thin soup. Bread that was hard but edible. It was eaten standing. By the second day, anger replaced fear. The women were no longer just tired, they were humiliated. Guards sat on crates outside, resting their legs while the prisoners stood inside. The contrast felt deliberate, even if it wasn't. They think we're animals.
One woman, a former office clerk from Mainz.
By the third day, the standing rule still hadn't been lifted. That was when one of the women, older than most, perhaps in her mid-30s, finally spoke up directly to an American guard. Her German was clear and firm. Her English was limited, but her meaning was not. "My legs," she said, pointing. "No sit. Pain." The guard looked at her. Really looked. He called over a medic. The medic knelt in front of her, pressing fingers gently against her calves, her ankles, the tops of her feet. He checked color, temperature, response. He stood up slowly. Then he said something that changed everything. "They need benches," he told the officer. "Wood, not the floor." The officer hesitated. "Wood," the medic repeated, "or we'll lose more." Within hours, planks began to appear. Not enough for everyone, not comfortable, but raised off the ground. Crude benches assembled from scrap lumber and packing crates. The rule wasn't lifted completely, but it was modified. The women were allowed to sit, briefly, in shifts, only on wood, never on concrete. No longer just tired, they were humiliated. Guards sat on crates outside, resting their legs while the prisoners stood inside. The contrast felt deliberate, even if it wasn't. Not from pain, but relief. Others laughed quietly, a sound that surprised even them. The guards didn't smile, they didn't celebrate. They simply watched, making sure no one stayed seated too long, making sure circulation returned safely. Over the following days, the system became routine. Stand, walk, sit briefly, stand again. Medical checks increased. Socks were issued where possible. No sit. Pain. The guard looked at her. Really looked. "They weren't trying to hurt us," one said quietly weeks later. "They were trying to keep us from losing our legs." The realization didn't erase the suffering, but it changed how it was remembered. By early 1945, as the war neared its end, many of these women would be transferred to larger camps, repatriated, or released. Some would return home with scars, physical and emotional. Others would carry the memory of those first days in captivity for the rest of their lives. Not as a story of cruelty, this began to appear. Not enough for everyone, not comfortable, but raised off the ground. Crude benches assembled from scrap lumber and packing crates. The rule wasn't lifted. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know then, was that sometimes in war, even mercy can feel like punishment when no one has the strength left to explain it. If these stories matter to you and you want them to reach more people, please consider liking the video. We're also very close to 1,000 subscribers, and your support truly helps keep these stories alive.